Okay.
Yeah. So on the website will be both the an attempted summary of what we did the week before, during that week, and maybe where we're going, and also the readings again, et cetera. So I'll try to post that weekly as much as I can. So, next week you can look for stuff on common sense, which we're going to try to engage today. The notion of philosophy of praxis, Jesuitism and Marxism. Some of these themes will be up there. All right. So let me go over the readings for this week. And the more I read of Gramsci, the more impressed I am. This level of thought in a very isolated situation. In my own research, I begin to know more about the intensity of his relationship with Pietro Sraffa, which I knew about, but supposedly Sraffa, the great political economist, brought him books, was always there. By the way, the letters from prison, I learned, were actually collated and edited by Togliatti during the Spanish Civil War. So this is another interesting moment that happened, in the production of Gramsci's corpus. All right. So today I want to do one thing that I think is important vis-a-vis Gramsci, and then I'll go back to the full course. You can divide his work into three stages in terms of the writings. The political writings, from really 21 to 1926. Then the letters from prison. Is another one. And then thirdly, the actual prison notebooks. Of which there are nearly 3,000 pages, 33 notebooks in total. And we only have selected amounts of these, and I just got a call from our friend Jeremy Glick. I didn't know that we only had the first three volumes that are in English. The new one that's commissioned by Columbia that Edward Said was behind, that's very incomplete. It's actually 33 notebooks. I think we have 10 to 12 of the ones of the projected 10-volume in English work. So we're missing a lot. We're still missing a lot. It's available in Italian, which of course gives the Italian scholars a huge, and Spanish too, exactly. Yep. It goes to show you, if you have a strong party, whether you like all of the dogma or not, you can at least get the works of these people. So anyway, so we're gonna, like I said, this begins in 1929, right? This is going on as early as 26. He starts to write letters when he's first arrested, all the way until his death. 36 really kind of marks it off. 37, he's in a prison hospital. So, and the political writings are 21 to 26. Let me just do this really quickly. 1919 to 1921 is the beginning of the New Order. And he writes under that. 1919 to 1920 is really the early parts of this. 21 to 22, he writes a great piece called Socialism and Fascism. And then 23 to his arrest in 26, or essays, journalistic pieces building the party, the Communist Party. This is a very important part of his life. And as I mentioned last week, 1911 is a very significant date. This is when he becomes very engrossed in the workers' movement in Italy, in Turin, when he sees the factories in Turin. This is a life-transforming experience for him. And He said, I quote from him, he says he never was a professional journalist, and in that he had the advantage of being the freest of journalists because he never had to hide his deepest convictions or please some boss or ruffian. This is Gramsci speaking. So he never really had to hide his deepest convictions or please some boss or ruffian, right, etc. When Lenin read the essays in New Order and saw how concentrated Gramsci was, we're going to need chairs here. Yeah.
There's an available spot here, Judith.
Oh, there's one in the middle there if you want, unless you want to be up front.
Do you want to be closed for hearing?
Yes.
You want to just sit over here? Yeah, I'll move this.
This is
Go ahead,
fine.
Beth,
Beth,
stay
stay
there.
where you
Stay
are.
with it. Yeah, stay there. That's fine.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, no problem. So, so Lenin actually chose Gramsci as, the heir to build the Communist Party in Italy. He was kind of almost knighted as the one against Amedeo Bordega, and this has become a debate for many years in the Italian communist circles and in the party. And the argument was really about parliamentary, whether you should enter into parliament or not. Bordega says stay away completely, whereas Lenin and Gramsci said we will make small inroads where we can, in terms of the war position. So this was a major thing, going on, and of course was what was called the United Front in Italy. They call it the single front, where the party was on the same page for all. This was basically from the Congress of 1921, and then again in the formation of the Third International was the single front, the United Front. So he's very immersed in the moment of his day. So that's why I call these purely political journalistic writings. He does not publish books. He's publishing pamphlets, socialism or fascism, etc. He actually the piece that Lenin liked was for a renewal of the Socialist Party. And he said that Gramsci's positions are in line with the Third International. So very, very close in that position. He went to a sanitarium in 1921 for health reasons. That's where he met the sister of his future wife. He met his wife through sister. They were in the sanitarium together. So Gramsci's physical ills also, had a very much of an effect on his life. And she lived in Moscow the rest of the time. I have a very funny thing too. I want to give you some background. He met with Trotsky in 22, and he wrote a letter on futurism, which was published in the Literature and Revolution collection of Trotsky's, and in which he says, a group of little schoolboys, the futurists, who ran away from a Jesuit school, made some noise in the nearby woods, and then were taken back under the stick of the forest ranger. That's what he thought of the Italian futurists, right? So anyway, you can see this was a very tough-minded man, very, very much ready to fight, okay? So, he never could get to the compromise in 24 with Bordega, although that was considered. And Mussolini, I want to tell you what Mussolini described Gramsci, that Sardinian hunchback, economics and philosophy teacher, an undoubtedly powerful mind. And as I read you last week, this was someone who the judge wrote the sentence, we must stop this brain from working for 20 years. And that was the sentence that was pronounced on him, and when he finally went to prison. All right, so and I want to mention one other thing, and I think this study group in some ways, or these classes are about this, at least in terms of my own, I guess, intentions and maybe where we should be coming from. I'm not positive about this as a dogma, but he says, I study for the sake of studying. This is Gramsci at work, where he says, I want to integrate multiple levels of learning. I'm not studying, quote, for a degree. I'm not studying for a career. I'm not studying for technical specialized knowledge. I'm studying really dialectically, where I can learn from economics, where I can learn from sociology, from aesthetics, etc. So this was always a maxim in his life, and you can see it at work reflected in his notebooks, in his prison notebooks. I study for the sake of studying. You know, I mean, it's kind of like art for art's sake in some ways, right? Which is nice, nice saying. Yes, please.
What books did he have access to in prison?
He had very little access. I mean, he was given Ricardo's book on political economy. He had a beat-up collection of the Divine Comedy. I think Pirandello, he had some of the plays there because he wrote on popular culture. You know, some works on German linguistics. He was very interested in the study of historical linguistics. Very, very important. You know, I mean, in some ways, I think he saw his twofold project in the prison notebooks was to produce a historical school of linguistics or study of linguistics, as well as produce a historical study of intellectuals. He was very much immersed in the question of the intellectuals, and this was always going on. Yeah, in education. Yeah.
So where did he read all of this philosophy that he comments on, in jail or before
Well,
jail?
before and after, yeah. I mean, you know, it's a good question. The main figure behind this was Croce, who I mentioned last week. Croce was really his teacher in philosophy, and someone we'll see referred to in the prison notebooks. We'll look at that today, you know, as a figure. Yeah, so Croce was certainly there. He certainly read, you know, I mean, again, this is someone that came up through a school system, very disciplined, very good, obviously, as a reader, right? I study for the sake of studying. So, I mean, from what I've gleaned, he really knows the history of philosophy extremely well. And whether he got this, you know, primarily from Croce still had a tremendous influence. It was an Italian Hegelian.
Yeah.
You know, we'll talk more about it. Idealistic Hegelian, who actually didn't side with Mussolini, but kept quiet, was not part of the resistance by any means, and not on the list. Right, and Gentili was the right wing of Hegelianism, whereas you could think of, you know, Croce as sort of a left liberal or a liberal wing of Hegelianism. If you have these two moments of the reading of Hegel that's going on in Italy, and Gramsci obviously falls to the left of Croce. And there's a long antagonism here, and hopefully I can point to it in the text. Right? So this is where so I mean, philosophy, yes, I think he had access to some philosophical works, but, you know, but not not a full working library by any means. And these books were brought in by Schraffa many times. You know, Schraffa had a kind of immunity because this was the leading political economist of Italy. You know, he could get back and forth, and, you know, and he was in Cambridge, you know, and this was Ludwig Wittgenstein's very close friend in this period. Yeah. And by the way, Bakhtin's brother, if you know, Mikhail Bakhtin, the great Russian literary critic, his brother Nikolai was Ludwig Wittgenstein's roommate in London for a long time. So you have all these kind of cross fertilizations going on, you know, that are happening. So anyway, so I think this is very, very important to keep in mind. This person that is actually he's very immersed in every struggle of his time. You know, between the PSI, the Socialist Party of Italy, the Communist Party, the formation, the building of a party. So he's very interesting on this thing. I mean, maybe next week Arto can speak a little bit to those kind of blocks, you know, that are put into place, you know, and why the war of position and why the war of maneuver. You know, we'll maybe, you know, touch upon that throughout the semester. And very active in this, and as I mentioned too, he's arrested as a member of Parliament. You know, he's elected to Parliament in 1924. You know, and he's given diplomatic immunity, like Tony Negre used, if you guys know the story, when Antonio Negre, who's still alive, lives in Venice, got himself elected to Parliament so he could get immunity from being jailed for being the theoretician behind the Rosso Brigado, behind the Red Brigade. So Negri had himself elected to a parliament in order to get, but, you know, it didn't work for a long period of time. They went after him, and, you know, how Negri got back into Italy was by going to jail for a while. living that sentence out for a little while, because they would free the other friends of his, of whom Paolo Verno was one, the grammar of the multitude. This Italian political scene is very rich in terms of, intrigue, Machiavellian politics, etc. It's very, very rich, this story, and I wish we could just narrativize for a long time, anyway, we're restricted by time. But this would make a great film. I don't think a film has been made of Gramsci, so if there are any budding filmmakers, this would be a great story to tell, in some ways, which Pasolini tried in certain respects, but, in different ways, and, certainly Bertolucci in Il Conformista, Gramsci is sort of behind this, in a way, the figure of Rossetti, the philosopher that is in Paris that's to be assassinated to keep the movement going on. So anyway, just so you have an idea, as Stanley was saying earlier today, it's really the logic of the antagonism is one way of reading that the dialectic antagonistically is really working on multiple levels in Gramsci's history. On the political level, on the intellectual level, and in his private letters as well. All of these things are extremely antagonistic, in a way. Yeah. So let me just go back for a second. I mean, I wanted to just break his work into sections. His writings into sections. So that we're going to spend today on Gramsci and maybe next week, and then we're going to move on. And I will send out the sections. You don't have to read all of it, because what Marx does is he transposes actual Hegel writing for pages and pages here, and then does comments. So we're going to read this, the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts from International Publishers. And this is a great edition. It's translated, edited and introduced by Dirk Struik, and I think it's a great introduction. Very good. And I'm framing this around the humanistic Marx. As you can see on the website and what I wrote up, that we will a close reading of the humanistic Marx, right? And I'm going to repeat this, what I did last week, that the 1844 Paris manuscripts are the beginning of a humanistic Marx, okay? And that we can also see in that period the dissertation, the difference between the Democritean and Epicurean theories of nature, as well as the 1843 critique of Hegel's philosophy of the state, the critique of the theory of the state, the philosophy of right, which Marx goes line by line and does a very interesting critique. It's a kind of great exercise in critique. All the way up to the German ideologies, where some people, such as Althusser, and Auguste Cornu, but particularly Althusser, see a break in Marx from the humanistic to the mature Marx, right, to 1845. We'll take this into account, but we will see an attack upon this by other people of the humanist strain as a continuation of Marx, right, that Marx is just developing and evolving as one school, that there's a continuous development, whereas in the Althusserian school and somewhat in the Italian school, there's a break between the humanistic and the mature Marx. Yeah. So we're going to do both of those schools of the break, as well as the Hegelian Marxist tradition, which is much more of the progressive development of Marx.
And the Althusserian and Italian are on the side of the humanistic.
No, anti-humanistic.
Opposite.
Opposite. Yeah. Yeah. The opposite. Yeah. Yeah. And so this presents problems to those who want to do Marx in philosophy. The problem, obviously, is that, if you think there's an epistemological break, what is the new epistemology? What's really going on here in terms of a whole new theory of knowledge? Vis-a-vis, Copernicus, Galileo, Newtonian physics, and all the philosophers up until then. How do we start approaching epistemology different? So this is along the lines of epistemology, not an aesthetic break. We're not thinking that way, that we may be able to attribute somewhat the inklings of that to the Frankfurt School, if there's an aesthetic break in Marx's approach, even though Marx wrote very little about aesthetics per se, very little. I mean, he makes comments, but you had the Nazarene movement and you had other movements, but the issue there would be about doubling and reduplication of images in history. And, is this ever sameness of imaging take place, in every historical epoch. Is there just this recycling that we're going through today?
Are you
Yeah, right through
saying,
it. Yeah.
are you saying the break, the rupture, is an epistemological one?
Yes,
for
it's an
Marx?
epistemological break. It's a
Could
break
you
with a
elaborate?
humanistic tradition. Well, the break would be creating a whole new language of which the human being, the human species or species being, is no longer privileged. It's really the object called capital that becomes a scientific study. So you're shifting from the standpoint of the worker, manual labor, or of the relationship between work and exploitation into a whole new dimension where the knowledge is really of the transformation of money into capital, and how is that working? In a nutshell. It becomes more complicated, but yeah,
No, that
in some
helps.
ways. But I mean, hopefully that helps, that he's really trying to look, Althusser and that school are looking at how, we should not read Capital. You put aside volume 1, the first part on commodities and fetishism, and you begin with a chapter on money, right? And this is the break that Marx is really affecting. That's just a kind of prologue. You read it, you go back to it, but this is kind of just a prologue that the humanist Marx still has in some ways. So this is a very interesting interpretation, especially in the era, to my mind, of fictitious capital. We talk about all this, decline in wealth, but you have to remember, just during Trump, we have had $6 trillion of new fictitious capital into the system, right? Which spends. Fictitious capital does not mean it doesn't exist. It means it's not tied to the productive forces. It's capital that's not tied directly to productive forces, at least at one part of the working definition. So this epistemological break, we're going to deal with it, both, ongoing, but also, if you see from the reading, when we get to Althusser in the 9th week, the historical task of Marxist philosophy, but certainly in the 8th week, because you have two people, who Sartre is probably the last great representative, if you will, of humanistic Marxism. And, I have an affection, I won't, put to Marx, to Sartre on that basis of the existential, psychoanalytic, and certainly in terms of the practico-inert, and these moments. And Henri Lefebvre, who sees the end of philosophy very much like Heidegger, in a way, and then tries to turn it into a meta-narrative. So we're going to look at those two who are, maybe Sartre's philosophical anthropology, and Lefebvre is a kind of re-narrativization of the history of philosophy from a materialistic point of view. And then, of course, Althusser, the structuralist. And you can see in between, we're going to look at the Italian schools, Della Volpe and Coletti, both of whom are anti-Hegelian. So this is what the anti-humanist tradition shares, is a kind of anti-Hegelianism, an anti-Gramsciism. So the Italian school that I have here, Coletti and Della Volpe, are not basically Gramscian. They know Gramsci, they know him very well, but they're not really a direct heirs to Gramsci. There's conflicts going on here, because Gramsci has a very Hegelian background vis-a-vis the Gramscian influence. So anyway, this is the reading list. Korsch is very easy. Stanley says to me today when we were walking over here, well, Korsch is a lightweight. I said, well, it's good to read the lightweights in between a little bit. And he says, no, okay. And then we're going to read Lukács on reification. So this is a major theme as well in terms of a reading of Volume 1. Lukács takes his point of departure from Volume 1 and the commodification of the world, right? The commodification thesis, right? See, this is what the Althusserians don't want to really deal with. It's commodification. They want to deal with scientific investigation into capital itself. The human beings are supports, Träger, and there's space superstructural relations that are keeping up this thing, and you need to destructurate at that level, that these are always structural problems, no matter what you do at the workplace, no matter where the organization is, even though they were very close to the party. to the French Communist Party, and very close to the workers, In fact, Balibar got kicked out of the party for writing a piece called "Open the Window, Your Windows, Comrades" in 1979. He got kicked out of the party for telling them to open up their minds, the French Communist Party. So anyway, about issues of their dogma, etc. But I'll try to go over this. But I hope you understand at least the basics. This epistemological break was very crucial for a whole generation of Althuserian Marxists, Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida too. I mean, there's no question. And of course, Fred Jameson here in the United States really comes very much, I think, out of the Althuserian model, at some levels.
So the epistemological break that you're referring
Yeah.
to is the humanists and the not humanists.
It's an overcoming of humanism and also what's called philosophical anthropology that still centers upon man, right? Is, anthropomorph-centric rather than scientific object capital as investigation. Yeah? See, instead of beginning with the laborer or the commodification process, you're beginning with the object capital itself, right? So it's another level of abstraction that's happening in this level. So, but for Lukács is going to talk about a very human thing, reification. How do we reify reality, in many ways? And Lukács considered himself, at the end, the major Marxist philosopher of the 20th century. So you have conflicting, points of view here. I'm sure Adorno considered himself the major Marxist philosopher. And, I don't think Althusser had both a humility and an arrogance. So I don't think he would have made pronouncements like that. But, Lukács did say this towards the end in the 60s, when he went back to Budapest. So we're going to read, hopefully, how they try to work with this. Korsch was actually a friend, also a member, and worked during the same time. So really our first 5-6 weeks will be centered in the period, of the 1920s up until, maybe the beginning of the fascist, takeovers, especially in Germany, the National Socialist takeovers. Right? So that's where we're going. We're going to read Coletti on the dialectic of matter. We'll try to begin to look at, materialism through his eyes. And I think I mentioned to you, with all fairness, that Coletti turned to the right. He became a supporter of Berlusconi, went crazy, etc. But was one of the best pupils of Della Volpe and very, very smart in this work called Marxism and Hegel in this relationship. So hopefully, and they're very good writers, both. I mean, Coletti especially, Della Volpe we're going to read on Italian Hegelianism, what I just put up here, the Croce and Gentili, because it'll give you, I think, a deeper understanding of where Gramsci's coming from. So anyway, so that's what we're going to do in terms of the readings. I have a tendency to go over the 10 weeks. I don't know what I'm going to arrange here. I don't know how much we'll get done, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. Maybe we can go to LIU Brooklyn, or maybe they'll give us another week here, etc. That's up to you guys. I can keep going. Like my that's Lumumba in this room. I thought we were in Castro's room, but anyway. Yeah. All right. So.
Oh, no.
Yeah. No, it's right. Yeah. So anyway, so I hope you go to the website and see this, and the dedication is to a friend of mine who I have a relationship with, and a very both volatile, but in some ways very enlightening and productive relationship with someone in Montreal. So anyway, I put that out. So I want to go back to the text and kind of situate. I know last week we were talking about the text as these jottings, preliminary points of reference for philosophy. And one other comment of Gramsci, I think I mentioned this last week, I'd like to be the corrosive acid of idiocy. So for those of you who think we live in the, idiocracy at this point, which certainly is a good enough, the IDEO scene, everybody talks about the Anthropocene or the capital scene. It's really the IDEO scene we're in. I mean, when you have people, I was really struck by this. I thought they'd go to all kinds of lengths, yes, but I didn't expect this. When Mitch McConnell can say Collins' speech was the equivalent of Margaret J. Smith's senator from Maine's speech against Joe McCarthy. How you can put the same two in an analogy is beyond me to begin with. And then the force of the speech, I'm sorry? Yeah.
That's turning Hegel over his head, right?
Yes, that's right. That's good. Yeah, indeed. That's good. Yeah. You only have to pay half price today. Yeah, anyway. That's good. No, very good. So, anyway, in the IDEO scene, and he also had, this was a very, because of his physical, problems, the hunchback, of course, and, many things, and we talked about how he had to hang, they would try to straighten his spine by hanging him from the rafters in some ways, right? That he did say that do not waste pity nor share tears. I hate those who do not take sides. So this was really a man of polemics and really very strong things. Okay, just to go back to this, so you know, the new order, Nouveau Ordine, is really intention was to build a cultural program, and one of their slogans is on the Marxist educational projects bookmarks: educate yourself because we will need all your intelligence, right? And this was a slogan of Gramsci, to educate, rouse, and militate, etc. So he always had that. The writings, I think were also intended, not that he's fully conscious. This is not, someone that's thinking hundreds of years into the future, but certainly way into the future. We're really intended with dialogues with future generations. It's also meant for the imminent moment of the struggle of the war position and what's going on, and he's sending out messages as well as, these notebooks for the party, but at the same time, it's really to open a dialogue with the future generations. And he said, criticism always must be militant and never indifferent or frigidly aesthetic, is a word he used, which is a nice phrase, frigidly aesthetic. Sometimes you get this feeling from Adorno and the aesthetic theory of the frigid aesthetic, in some ways,
Gramsci
please.
favored sarcasm, which is something he read in Marx.
I was going to
That
comment
Marx
on that and cite you as well.
The
But you
article
can go
I
ahead,
sent,
yes, you
he
sent an
felt
article.
that
Yeah.
irony was too aristocratic.
Yes.
And for a workers' party, we needed sarcasm.
Right.
Biting
Yes,
sarcasm,
yes, indeed. Yes, that's right.
which is the etymology in Greek.
Okay, well, since you brought that up, I already, I'll go to it already. Chris sent out a piece from Salvage, which is a very good British journal, with Richard Seymour, China Milleville, the writer who rewrote October, etc. And it's a very good journal about, it's a pessimism of the intellect, no question about it, and its thrust. And in the notebook of Gramsci, this is number 29 of the first notebook, Gramsci says sarcasm as an expression of the transition among historic epochs, right? And he said, and I'm looking both at Marx and him here, that we find something called pessimistic sarcasm in opposition to belief in justice, equality, and fraternity, or what it's called the elements of the religion of humanity, going back to this humanistic mark, that some people really actually believe in this kind of triad, right? Equality, fraternity, and liberty, right? And justice, right, at this point. And he wants to mock, first of all, not the intimate feeling of this experience of injustice or slavery or non-freedom or of lack of sister and brotherhood, but the illusions, the contingent form which is linked to the perishable world, right? To a world that can really be overcome. So he's really, in some ways, Marx is talking about the cadaverous smell. What he calls the laboratory of life is to examine the putrefaction, right? This is where the original thing comes up, and the leaks from what he calls the painted facade. So this is Marx speaking that Gramsci takes up as organized sarcasm, as organized, that it becomes a very didactic device, right? So, and it's contrasted to right-wing sarcasm, which you see all over Fox News. If you ever watch, I'm so perverse. I watch Laura Ingraham about 5 minutes once or twice a week to figure out what they're doing, And she has her token homies next to her, and Democrat Party strategists, Afro-American, nice suit, good tie, broad shoulders, and she refers to him as her friend. No, I'm telling you, they study this. So anyway, but this is what it's rarely passionate, and it's always negative. And it's not the form itself of sarcasm, but it's a mockery of the human form. This is the way the right takes up sarcasm, which is different than what Gramsci is saying about organized sarcasm, which is going to really look at what the system does and talk about this. I mean, I read Capital on this line as black humor, in a way. I mean, it is a work in the literary genre of black humor. If you read The Working Day carefully, you see the black humor. And you could actually hear Marx sometimes, one voice is that of laughter through this sarcasm, and a very deep sense of humanity as well. I think it's going on together. So the right-wing sarcasm is mechanical, it's parrot-like, and then what ultimately can happen on the left is that it gives rise to satirical observations. This is what happens when it becomes repeated, etc. We see this happening. So this is a transitional expression in Marx, which establishes a break from the older conception, we have of something, to a new, and gives force of the new popular conviction. So sarcasm becomes a device to be used to educate, right, the workers, right? An educated device. It becomes a new taste and a new language, but it also is taking from the vernacular together. So I think this also fits a little bit with the dialect that we read in note, 2 on language of Gramsci last week. Okay? So anyway, I wanted to say that it gives you a new taste and a new language. This is the purpose of the sarcasm, and as a didactic device, etc. Yeah. Anything you want to add to this? I mean, yeah, you sure?
Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, it's all, okay. I mean, but it's interesting because we speak sometimes in these tones of sarcasm, but sometimes we don't really know the effect, right? And what is its historical force? And I think this is what Salvage is trying to do, by reorienting one towards both Gramsci and Marx. Yeah. And that it has a very positive effect, right? In a way. It's yeah. I can send it out. Yeah. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, the thing about the sarcasm for Marx is, again, can be compared to Lacan when he's excommunicated from the International Psychoanalytic Association, and he spends 11 years teaching, and then finally Althusser arranges a space for him to come back in 1964. And the first thing he does is he acknowledges his friends in the audience, who are all great names: Ferdinand Bardel, the great Marxist historian, Claude Lévi-Strauss, etc. He goes on, and then he starts in, apart from the verbiage about the rights of man, I am here. Am I qualified? He starts with this. So, here's someone that, the Declaration of the Rights of Man to him is verbiage, at this point, in terms of expression, in terms of the rights to, dissent, etc. So he understands this viscerally as well, and I think we all do in a way. But Marx is going to turn this into a positive rather than the negative it is. And you see how the right wing uses it. That's why I use this example of McConnell. What does Joseph McCarthy have to do, in a way, right, as an object of derision, to left people like, she's left liberal, Harris, Cory Booker. I'm not crazy about these people, don't hear me wrong, but these are not McCarthy-like people. This is the amazing thing, or Dick Durbin, Dick Durbin. But anyway, and who else was Blumenthal? All these guys, there were Coons.
Booker.
Yeah, Booker from New Jersey. So this is the way of how they reframe things and work with this kind of right sarcasm. And most people are going to buy this. This is the problem, because many people don't really understand. We do, of course, what McCarthyism means. We can see through it, the painted facade. We, can work. But most people in the United States, oh yeah, what a brilliant speech. She iced it. She's going to be the queen, of this. She's one of the biggest corporate donors per capita to her campaigns than anywhere else. Yeah. Anyway, all right, so enough of her. Okay, I just wanted to mention one other thing before we go back to the text, the relationship to Freud. Gramsci never really studied psychoanalysis per se. He wanted, as I mentioned last week, the introduction to psychoanalysis. He asked for it. He never got a copy of it. But he did write, and this is a great phrase, it seems to me the diffusion of Freudian psychology has given rise to a kind of 18th century literature, the savage in modern form, has been now replaced by the Freudian type. The struggle against the juridical order is carried out through Freudian psychological analysis. This, it would seem, is one aspect of the question. I have not been able to study Freud's theories, and I do not know the other type of so-called Freudian liberation, right? And then literature, and he does not know the type of Freudian literature. And the three people he considers part of Freudian literature were Marcel Proust, right? Suevo, Italo Suevo, Ettore Schmidt Suevo was his pseudonym. If you've never read it, you want to exercise in dialectical paradox, Confessions of Zeno. I don't know if you know this, but he was a good friend of James Joyce, Italo Suevo, and of course Joyce, the Joyce of Ulysses, all the modernist stuff that Lukács stayed away from. Lukács never wrote on Proust, never wrote on Joyce, couldn't stand modernist literature, but at least Gramsci is aware of it, right? Through Suevo and through Freud and a new type that is being created. In some ways, I think one argument could be made that Freud legitimized, through his theories of the unconscious and drives, modernist fiction. He actually gave it, legitimization, right, in a sense. Joyce's experiment, where you reduce the odyssey of 20 years to one day in the life of a working class man walking through Dublin, Leopold Bloom, right, and etc. And Leopold Bloom, by the way, is drawn from the caricature of Suevo, in a sense. And then, of course, Finnegan's Wake, who knows what to make of that? That's another thing. We're still in the river run past Adam and Eve. But anyway, so Suevo, Proust, and Joyce are the literary people that he considers the form of a kind of Freudian type, a new type that is being done, and of course, he never really wrote on stream of consciousness, even though he was very fond, if you read deeper into the prison notebooks, of William James, especially the principles of psychology. He had a very deep appreciation of William James. And also of Josiah Royce, who actually built, I don't know if you know Josiah Royce, but he was the one who started the kind of the interpretive communities, he wanted to build interpretive communities through the thing, of a religious nature. But, so Gramsci was extremely well educated, not only in his time, and again, this is from a prison letter that he's writing, right? So he wanted this. He talked also about Freud's influence on German literature, and the new type of noble savage that is corrupted by society, that is by history, gives rise to an interesting new form of intellectual disorder. That was his interpretation of Freud, without having read the theory, having an understanding. Yeah, please.
Was he familiar with Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities?
I'm sure he was. I don't think they're anything, but that sort of ushered in the century, right? Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
written,
Same period, yeah.
in the
Yeah,
1920s.
the 20s,
It
yeah.
takes place in 1913, but it
Right,
was written
right.
in the 20s.
That's right.
But,
Yeah.
it seems to me I'm about a little less than halfway through, but it seems to me much more Freudian than like Thomas Mann, who's had seemed to have a more antagonistic view towards Freud.
Well, he wrote, Thomas Mann, by the way, commemorated Thomas Mann on his 80th birthday. A very beautiful essay called Freud in the Future.
Thomas Mann.
Yeah, he gave the address to Freud on his 80th birthday. So I don't know. I mean, maybe he was antagonistic at times, but
in
yeah.
Magic Mountain, he really.
Magic Mountain. That's true. That's true. Yeah, early on. Yeah. Although you could make a case, Dr. Faustus is an exercise in the unconscious in certain ways. That madness. People become so mad with their artistic genius that they'll inject themselves with syphilis in order to experience that madness. Right? Yeah.
Take LSD.
Yeah. Well, I think it's different with the
Yeah,
syphilis.
right.
You can survive, in a different way back then. Okay. So anyway, I wanted to mention that too. He has, very few entries, but he does have a relationship somewhat to psychoanalysis, but not really active. Okay, so I want to go to the relationships here again in the text. So we'll do a lot of textual work today. So let's turn to back where we were. I'm going to give you some correlative pages too through this, maybe a better way to read it in such a way where he returns to certain themes. So on page 324, note 1, you can also read pages 344 and 345, which kind of fill out what he's doing here, right, of philosophy. He'll talk about the philosophy of the philosophers, the groups of intellectuals. So I'm just trying to give you some, connections that goes on. And in note 3, the language, he'll go back to that. And I think, again, this is something that, we'll talk about more and more. There was an argument in Italy about national languages. There was a man named Gobetti, who was a member of the party, who really took the way of the elites, that you really build towards the international and national language. Whereas in Gramsci, there was still a fight about the dialect. So don't read this section, this note 3 that we went over last week, page 335, the conception of the world. This is actually a kind of veiled polemic against Gobetti within the party about the role of language, right, and what to do with about educating people. This is a very interesting section, right? Very interesting section, right? And, in a way, Gramsci, reading between the lines here is trying again to reach out to the peasants. This is really what this is about, ultimately, the peasants and the peasant dialect. And this was a big argument, as you know, the peasant question in communist history was always a huge, huge question. So for Gramsci, he wanted to keep the peasants actively educated, and also would use Marx's phrase, the educators themselves must be educated at times, against Gobetti, who wanted to say, no, we need a top-to-bottom approach, a trickle-down or a more, revolution from the top. So always keep in mind with Gramsci, this is always about revolution from below. It really is. I mean, this is, to me, the most attractive part of this, in a way. I don't think the Frankfurt School is about revolution from below, you know, in some ways. I mean, it's kind of a very different approach. What, you're looking at me, what? Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I'm just taking that in.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, in a sense, I think that Gramsci, coming from Sardinia, having, you know, the difficulties, having been raised in southern Italy, being around factories, etc., had a very different sensibility about one's conception of the world and what one could do with it. Whereas, you know, the Frankfurt School were highly educated, you know, very well-off, affluent people in a time of turmoil. Not to diminish, I mean, you know, we need all of this, you know, in a sense. But Gramsci is much more about the revolution from below. And this has been a question that has gone on about the Frankfurt School for a long time, have they denied, in a sense, the below, you know, in a sense, and does it become a kind of top to bottom, that we study up only, we don't really study from below? You know, I think the dialectical thing to do is study up and also study from below, and that's kind of the trick, which is very hard to do. And given the idiocy of some of the popular culture today, I mean, it's pretty hard to study this stuff without going mad, you know, in terms of seeing what's going on, or there are elements there. But that's a Gramscian approach to culture, from below, you know, yeah, in a way, yeah, you know. And so I want to just point that out. This is also going on in between the lines, if you will, in note number 3, and then creating a new culture. So today what I want to concentrate on, page 325, is the notion, and maybe I can ask you, what do you understand about common sense? You know, this is a crucial term. Common sense is etymology, is from communis sensus, yeah? But this should be, you know, this is a very complicated term in Gramsci, so maybe we can, you know, talk about what do you understand by this from your reading, or
I think for
any
him,
thoughts?
For him, it was something that everybody had,
Okay, yes,
and
yep, it's part of spontaneous philosophy, right?
and not necessarily a good thing either.
Okay. Spontaneous philosophy, right? We have the elements of which common sense is one, right?
And
And
kind of
everyone, he
tied-
destroys the prejudice of that, you know, not everyone is a philosopher, and the reason everyone is a philosopher, that the elements of language itself is a determined series of concepts and notions, and the totality is there in all of us. That common sense we share, you know, we have some of this in differing degrees. And then, of course, the folkloric tradition, of which religion, being the most important, is a fragment of common sense. And I want to keep that active in our minds, because a lot of people try to separate. For Gramsci, religion is a fragment, it's a break off, it's a fracture from common sense. Okay? So some other people about, you know, I know what about. Yeah.
Popular sense, I think.
Yeah, there's a popular sense here too.
That's
right,
what he
right,
means
right.
by common, is that it's popular. So he's really talking about popular culture,
Right.
which involves folklore and religion and
Yes.
all.
So as a cultural term, it has a very rich connotation, you know, so hence the name of the what would we call him? I guess he's a rapper, Common? Is he a rapper, or is he a hip-hop artist, or just an artist?
You got me, you're blacker than
I'm
I
just
am.
kidding. Someday.
Common is a rapper
Fair
who
enough.
wouldn't fit the Gramsci's common sense.
No, of course not. But I mean, we
Common
have-
is really trying to re-educate.
Right, okay, all right. So this comes to be, you know, in some ways, and going back, yeah, tomorrow.
Does
yeah.
it have any affiliation with the utilitarian, or is that going to?
Yes, it does.
too
It has
far?
both an affiliation to empiricism,
Yeah.
you know, and also to utilitarianism, as well as to the Kantian notion, and this is where I find it very interesting, communis sensus, the sense of the community, the meaning and the direction of the community. Yeah, you wanted to add?
Yeah. Does he say it? Does he call it ideology, or?
No,
Is he-
ideology is what you begin to understand about this, because there's gonna be a movement, and maybe I should diagram this too. I'll do it in a minute, but ideology and politics begin to study common sense through what he calls good sense,
Right.
which is the philosophical and an intellectual order.
Right.
So philosophy brings intellectual order to something that does not have real order. Okay, so this is what he's gonna do, and then you begin to take a step back and you can reflect upon it, and you're able to see it as ideology and then as politics, because it's not only ideological, it's
Right.
political, right? And he's very good at working both of those terms together, of which, you know, obviously, I mentioned last week, Althusser's ideological state apparatuses comes directly out of Gramsci and other thinking, but he's very heavily influenced by Gramsci here, yeah. So anybody, some other, yeah, please.
Just to
yeah,
clarify
yeah,
though,
yeah,
so-
yeah.
So there is an influence of, I don't know, mainstream ideology on common sense, is that what's?
Yes, well, the way
Mainstream
common
ideology
sense is formed, you
has
have to
a
ask the
powerful
question, and he asks this question because he has a philosophical mind. What are the presuppositions of getting to such a term? Right, how do we get to common sense? How does something become common sense? So there's a long history there that becomes historically located. Not that it's false, it's not always false, you know? It's not always
I see.
false, right? It becomes part of a historical moment, a culture. And what it does is it establishes, you know, on another level, norms. It establishes both norms, right, and value construction. So the family could be considered as a part of communist census, in a way, what Althusser takes up as one of the ideological state apparatuses, how the state ultimately will use this in terms of subtle coercion, etc. You know, yeah, please, yeah.
Could it be the same as what Foucault calls the dispositif?
I don't know if it's the same. I think he's riffing off of Gramsci. He also said, you know, Gramsci's the most widely quoted and the least understood of all 20th century thinkers. I don't know what he meant, but anyway, I can see.
But
that
Foucault uses the
yeah.
dispositif to
Right.
distinguish between epistemes.
Right.
And when you talked about common sense
Yes.
being
No, that's a
historical
good
in
point.
nature,
That's a good point, yes, yeah. I don't know if you guys know, I don't want to lose people, but Michel Foucault's work, especially in the order of things, right, or words and things, more literally translated, goes through what he calls epistemic regimes, right? Regimes of where something becomes knowledge, how a regime is formed, and that this knowledge becomes dominant in a particular period of time, and he has segments about this. You know, he has a kind of not epochal sense of time, but a more periodization, you know, through centuries, right? So we live in the episteme of labor, life, right, and language, linguistics, labor, life, biology, linguistics, and labor studies or work, right? And this is the triad under which we're always working. So, yeah, in many ways. And he says out of these dispositifs, these regimes, comes what he calls discursive regularities. So there's a regulation of discourse of which we all participate in. So the language itself becomes part of the sensus communis. So if you're an academic, you speak a certain language at the conferences. You may speak a different language, you know, at midnight when you've had a few drinks, right, etc. But anyway, the issue here is how do these regimes and these regularities take place? So Gramsci speaks of this. How we get to the common sense is through what he calls the socialization of ideas. The socialization of ideas. How does this occur, you know, over a long period of time? You know, this is what we should be looking for. How does an idea itself, an eidos, and the ethos in which it was created, how does this come to be, right? And then becomes part of the dominant communist census, right, etc. And he thinks that religion is an offshoot of this. At the same time, he's not negating, right, you know, so the term itself, I want to be very clear about this. I mean, I'm going to be ambiguous because that's one of the definitions. It's a very ambiguous, contradictory, and multi-layered, faceted term. You know, because there is something you could say, and I don't like doing this, but there is a common sense that we all participate in. It's very exact, and it looks at the series of judgments. How did we get there? So we're looking also into how does knowledge become part of common sense? What is that judgment that is made that makes something a theory, right? How does that become ultimately then domesticated, if you want to use that kind of language? How does this occur in terms of the judgment? And then for Gramsci, the positive part of common sense, it's not allowed to be drawn into a metaphysical realm, right? Pseudo-profound, right? You just don't, push it aside, brush it aside. Pseudo-scientific, and that it doesn't reduce itself to just absurdities and quibbles. So this is a powerful concept in him. We're very, very powerful in terms of the positive. On the other side, the conservative side of it, it's not disruptive. You cannot really disrupt it. It has to be, taken over by good sense and philosophy, right? And you have to ask, why is it not disruptive? And really, the common sense in terms of a location is really the site of struggle to win people over. Right? This is really the site. The site of the struggle is to win people over, right? Win people over to the cause, if you will. Whatever. This is why he's going there so strongly, right? So, the task here, it's multi-layered, but the first task is to understand how a theory comes to be accepted as common sense. Beth would know this in medicine. How does a theory in medicine, the working stuff, how does it come to be accepted as common sense, right? And then, then you have to look at it vis-a-vis the empirical tradition, where we're going to go to. Does it have evidentiary, evidence? Does it have evidentiary force, right? Does it really yield this kind of evidentiary force? So this is another aspect of it too. How does the theory become a theory? Through what series of judgments do we get there? And this goes back to Foucault, very influenced here in the sense of when does that theoretical, epistemological act, legitimated? We're dealing here with aspects of what becomes legitimated in our worlds, right? In our societies. In all fields, right? He's really got onto something here. How does this socialization of ideas, and then how does the norm, how we talk in this vernacular, the new normal, right? This is common sense speaking, very much Gramsci, all the time. That's the new normal. Trump's antics are the new normal. We totally expect it. He's become socialized into common sense, but in the worst form, right? In a way. So this doesn't have to do with knowledge itself, right? It's basically how does the theory itself become justified, in its practice, and how does it come to be? So you have to start with the critique always for Gramsci. The political move, the agency here, if you will, is to critique the old common sense. The old common sense, right? Yeah. The old common sense. So how do you do that? How do you do that? How do you, in psychoanalysis, actually change the light bulb? Right? In a sense, right? Yeah, right, exactly. Right, yeah. But how do you break up a repetition compulsion? Is that possible? Right? In a certain way. How do you replace that common sense, which is part of the everyday practice of psychoanalysis? How can you break up that pattern? Is that a possibility, or is the drive so powerful it's going to happen? Why does fascism, the return of the repressed, would also be here? How does fascism come back and show its ugly face? To me, I'm sorry I'm harping on this, but I watched a little bit this week. But anyway, this last result in the Supreme Court, this Kavanaugh, is just the culmination of their 40-year program. Now they're going to wash their hands. We're successful. It's over. We control all three branches of government. Our program's in line. We have shifted the discourse, the dispositif and the discursive regularity so far to the right that Bernie Sanders, the old man, looks like some screaming radical, and we can take care of him easily, right? This is where we are. We have no threats from below. Black people aren't organized. The Hispanics aren't organized. The immigrants aren't organized, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Well, you just reminded me years ago when I was studying Gramsci, reading an essay by Stuart Hall on Thatcherism.
Stuart Hall?
Yeah,
Okay.
Thatcherism and Gramsci, Gramsci and Us,
Yeah.
it's called,
Yeah,
where he talks about
Right.
how she
Right.
was so successful.
yes.
And it was.
We're 40 years later, Beth, unfortunately, huh? Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry to say, I mean, yes, I know. I mean, I'm not talking about our age, I'm talking about the program itself. Yeah, it's very sad, yeah. What's going on?
Gramsci and Us, I
Yeah.
think, Stuart
Yeah.
Hall.
Stanley wrote on Gramsci and
It's
education
a
too,
really
by the way.
worth reading.
Yeah,
um,
yeah, race studies, yeah, please, yeah. Yeah. You got it?
I got it.
Okay, what were you gonna say, Dave?
Oh, yeah, I was just thinking, you know, from the other side, I mean, after, when people were stunned after, Trump won and you know, and, the right began to consolidate, there was this desperation almost, you know, the phrase, this is not normal, you know, and people, you know, sensed that it was likely to become normal, that we were going to internalize it, and there was a kind of psychological collective struggle to keep it from becoming normalized, which I think was in a way doomed to failure. But,
Right.
But it's, you know, it's an interesting, it's the other
Mhm.
side of it is a resistance to something becoming normalized.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, yeah, and then.
I'm just
Bartok.
gonna suggest that if we're talking about the sort of crisis of this particular moment.
Yes,
Isn't it in part that the liberal co-optation of the below has sort of resulted in a kind of vacuum that's been filled
yes.
by the right, essentially?
No, it's a good-
And
very
in a
good
way,
point,
the-
yeah.
The success
It's a
of their
Gramscian point,
the success
yeah.
of their project
Hmm?
is
Yeah.
perhaps a result of the failure of liberalism.
Right,
Or the absence of that.
Well, yes. I mean,
That's what Stuart
or the-
Hall
or
says in
liberalism,
this essay.
You know,
Right.
co-optation or suppression of
right,
it,
right.
in a way.
I mean, Gramsci calls common sense, just to play on what you just said, the folklore of philosophy,
Yeah, because
right, in some ways.
Being
So
so
the-
distressed at
yeah.
the loss of, one could say, common sense, is, you know, things
Yeah.
are normal, it is not a.
The folklore of the Democratic Party is the party of the Afro-Americans, the party of the poor, the party of those, you know, exploited. We're the ones that are gonna get you the fair share. Government intervention, right, et cetera, that has been, you know,
But
as you
having done
said,
nothing
complete.
for people, really.
Yes, of course not, yeah, exactly, yeah, please, Arthur.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, because you, maybe this builds on your point as well, but when you said that Gramsci emphasizes that philosophy converts common sense into good sense, right? So-
No, not, yeah, I mean, good sense is the order that's on the way to philosophy and praxis.
Right,
So the
so-
transition, I'll do this, go ahead, keep
So
talking.
in other words, a movement out of common sense into something else is not really possible without having these structured ideas on all levels of engaging with what common sense is. So for example, if you're a leftist party or organization struggling against, you know, the liberal order or whatever, you have to be able to target common sense on all of its levels, right? That it
Right.
exists in society, the cultural field, and you have to say something about religion. You have to be able to say
Yeah.
something about the future,
Right.
and the past and the present. And, you know, it seems like he was very kind of ahead of his time in detecting perhaps what was the greatest weakness of 20th century radical thought, Marxism, or anarchism, of course, because anarchism is a deficiency in philosophical thought, but Marxism was running out of steam, ironically. I mean, I think this is the subtext to Gramsci's urgency. That
Yes.
That the irony is that at the height of the Third International's power, he already read and understood, because he knew, like, Lenin and the leadership
Right.
of the Russian Revolution, the infighting, the crisis in philosophy on the left was
Right.
already happening.
Right.
And of course, we can raise the question here, it's a speculative question, is the defeat of Marxism and political defeat of Marxism is actually prepared by its intellectual defeat. I mean, in the trajectory of the 20th century, do we have philosophers who are fighting under the banner of revolutionary transformation of liberal society?
No, very little.
On the level
Yeah.
of Heidegger?
Yeah,
or
no
on the
level.
of
No
Heidegger,
level.
or on the level
No.
And the
No.
answer is we don't,
No.
after Gramsci's generation. And that's
No, you
because
had the Frankfurt School,
they're
which,
not,
yeah,
but I'm
yeah,
saying they're
yeah.
not on that level.
Yeah.
You know, and,
Yeah.
and I just thought about it because you mentioned Foucault, and Foucault, I think, is the only major 20th century philosopher after World War II that engages seriously with the big and influential names on the right, like Hayek, von Mises. You know, he reads, you know, Schumpeter seriously.
Becker, Human
Becker.
Capital, I mean, which is
Other
now
leftist
taken up by,
philosophers, including, you know, names that we cite here in that generation.
Well,
of our times.
our friend
we
Rick
don't need
Wolf
these people.
never
Yeah,
mentions
Rick
the
Wolf.
Chicago schools
We
in
make fun of these
regular
people, like
ways.
Becker's an idiot, or that other
Yeah.
guy's an idiot. So we have no answers to what the right wing does on the level of philosophy. You know, and that concludes today, like Peter
Right.
Thiel,
Right.
you know, the guy
Yep.
who found PayPal, and he's trained in philosophy.
Mhm.
He's teaching a seminar at Stanford. They're reading Marx. They're reading, you know, von
Mhm.
Mises. They're reading
Mhm.
Schumpeter. And I mean, we're trying to counter that, of course, in
Yes.
our own little way. But
Yeah, in
as
our
a
way,
general
yeah.
on the left, we don't read this. We talk about Trump.
Peter Thiel can donate a lot of money to us if you like, you know, no question.
And, you know, that would be a good conversation.
We won't go to
Peter
school.
actually,
We
that
will
would be
promise
good.
them we won't go to school.
What I'm saying is there's a major strategic defeat here that Gramsci would totally probably point out. That,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
we do not
yeah.
know the common sense and how
Yeah.
it's formed today
Yeah.
from the left.
Unless
we focus on
right.
Trump, but
That's
Trump
right.
is just a symptom, and not Trump was only possible after Becker wrote these extraordinarily influential.
What is the common sense of the left
redefining
liberal
humans
today?
as capital, for example.
We're gonna
For
protest,
example.
we're gonna demonstrate, and we're gonna contribute money against Susan Collins's campaign.
It's
And we're gonna
reactive.
go electoral politics, and we're gonna vote these people out. And who are you gonna replace them with? The first question you're gonna ask, what do they stand for? And I listen, all due respect to the younger generation, but I listen to an Ocasio speak. I mean, you know, she needs education.
Right.
I mean, you know, really, in all good,
just
you know,
want to add
I mean,
that-
she's already on the cover of Vogue magazine. We can see what's happening. I mean, you know, this is very easy. Yeah, go ahead
I
and
just
end the
wanna add,
gentleman.
like,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
we're talking
yeah,
about
yeah,
capital,
yeah, sorry,
I should
yeah,
just point,
yeah.
like, on the left, we know, because we've read Capital in our own way, and we've
Yeah.
studied the tradition, whether it's Harvey or something
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
more
yeah.
interesting or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. We should just study it ourselves, yeah. Ourselves.
The point is, we have a working definition of capital.
Yeah, yeah.
Whether it's like layered in a certain way or another way.
Right.
But on the right hand, the anti-left philosophical thought, Gary Becker, you know, University of Chicago.
Sure.
That Foucault engaged with, he redefined capital. He said capital, actually, all people have capital. A worker owns capital and their ability to do labor.
Yeah.
Which is a total different
Yes.
take compared to the Marxist.
I mean,
tradition.
look, the interesting
And
thing.
that
yeah,
tradition
yeah.
is dominant now.
Yeah.
I mean, people think of, I have my
Yeah.
own capital.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and there is some truth to that too, the
Yes.
innovative worker versus
right.
the non-innovative worker.
Well, that's
right?
what drives something like the right to work movement, you know, that.
Right.
But it's
you
also
don't-
literally
You don't
true.
need unions, you just need the right to work.
That's
laws
right.
But it's
that
also
protect-
literally true on the
Protect your right
level
to
of-
work.
Right.
Of
That's right.
innovation, like innovative labor.
That's where
should
Janice
be
took its
surplus
point of
labor.
departure from,
To surplus value
obviously.
extraction.
Yeah.
And labor that is not very innovative just reproduces itself. So
Right.
these are the,
Right.
so these are major corrections to Marxism, but we don't think about it that way if we don't read
Well, yeah.
these other.
Another problem, except for, you know, really great, you know, pockets, Marxism never really developed a culture. That's another thing. You had the great period of the, you know, creative expression of 1917 to maybe 26, and then pockets, you know, with the Mexican muralists, and you can go through the whole, you know, all of this, you know, Alice Neal in the States, etc. Some work in painting, some work in theater, etc. But the culture never really took hold. The common sense has never been built, really, in a lot of ways, you know, which is that the right has had almost complete control over this. I mean, we have our pockets, we have our journals, we have our, you know, sometimes off-Broadway theater and this kind of stuff, you know, occasionally a good film here or there, but the culture has never been brought, the common sense has never been brought in. Yeah, yeah.
We have,
Yeah.
the left is constantly reactive.
Right.
Even the Frankfurt School is reactive. They're
Yes.
not offering an alternative common sense of working propaganda, if you like, for the
Yes.
working classes. We have to have our own narrative, our own folklore, our own religion,
The
if you
interesting
will.
thing is Goebbels learned more from Nietzsche than the left did. You know, how do you become a great sloganeer? How
Yeah.
do you become a propagandist? Nietzsche's exceptional at this. You know, the
left
uses and
has
the
to do
abuses
that.
of history. You read this stuff carefully, really, in a way, Nietzsche, at one level, is a great aphoristic, you know, propagandist.
You can't
know?
argue.
He's a thinker,
You
obviously.
can't
I'm not-
argue
I'm not
with
diminishing
the
it, but-
common sense with logic.
Right.
It's like going against.
Well, there is a logic to this. This is what he's saying. It's part of a long period of socialization of ideas. But what was transmitted, you know, you can talk to most leftists today, and they're not going to be able to tell you who Boris Eichenbaum, Viktor Shklovsky, are. Or they tell you the difference between the debate between Eisenstein and Ziga Vertov on the future of cinema. These are all very prominent debates that are very, very crucial, that you'll read, some of you that do Stanley's course, you'll read in the work of art in the age of technical reproduction. Yeah. So this is a problem. You don't have that cultural transmission. Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah.
Basically, the
Yeah.
right has organic intellectuals than the left.
Yes.
That's it.
If you want to call them
No,
organic
yeah.
intellectuals, because the left has a lot of traditional intellectuals now.
Right.
If you want to draw that distinction, the traditional intellectual is the one who reinforces the status quo. And you get that reinforcement of the status quo out there, Yeah. You get this reinforcement of the status
I
quo
mean, they also
constantly.
have all the money behind them. That
Yeah,
helps.
yeah. And as I mentioned last week, one of the great examples of the failure of organic intellectual in terms of a crisis was in the film Battle of Chile, where the organic so-called intellectuals are meeting with the workers, and the workers want to take the state when the CIA is intervening, and it's not time yet, not time yet, this is too much for us, it's like, the LIU and the lockout, it's too much, we might lose our job. I'm sorry, I have to go to my own personal traumas here. Yeah.
As I recall, they were basically agents of the Allende government. I mean, in that one scene where the workers were asking for weapons because they saw the coup was coming, and these folks from the government went into the factory and said, it's not time, and you'll scare off international investment to boot.
Yes.
And, so, I don't recall, I'm sure there were times where there were intellectuals too, but it seemed like mostly they were functionaries. of
Yeah,
the
but
Allende.
Gramsci's very aware of this, even within the party. This is what he's doing, constantly, and then sometimes it unwittingly the party does this, right, in terms of the workers, et cetera. It's not time yet, et cetera. If you look at May of '68, if the CP had gone full force and this had become a labor struggle alongside the student struggles, you may have had that state much longer, in a way. It was basically the party that put an end, with de Gaulle, of course, the compromise was made in June of '68, it set a whole new moment in place, And also look at it this way too, and France is a great example. They elect a Socialist Party member, Mitterrand, that almost every organic intellectual gets excited about, except Alain Badiou, right? The old Maoist. But most of the intellectuals, Roland Barthes lined up, Jacques Derrida, they're all lined up to go see, the new government, to get funds. So, I hear what you're saying, that, that these agents are put out there and paid for, but at the same time, it seems to me, in terms of the party in the war of position, makes big mistakes, in where Gramsci's going here. Yeah.
One of the interesting things
Yeah,
Gramsci
yeah.
used to do
Yeah.
is bring philosophy and politics together.
Yes,
He-
and history.
Well,
Yeah,
of course,
obviously
all
history.
historical,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
just, and then at the end of the thing, he says something about, every philosopher is a politician, which is sort of interesting, and that a politics without philosophy is going to result in a kind of, it won't result in revolution for sure, but will sort of stagnate forever.
Right. For Gramsci, going back to this notion of ideology, it's only structure that changes ideology. It's not just consciousness.
Right, yeah.
Right? This is very important to remember also, that a lot of people talk about if we only knew, if we were only conscious of that. It's actually the structure needs to change for the ideology. He's very well aware of this in the war of opposition on the way to the war of maneuver. Very, very aware of this. Right. So, anybody else before we go back to the text, or any other? Yeah, I know we, a little bit of deviation to the contemporary scene here. Okay, so I want to go back to, just to go back about this movement here. And I put this diagram on the board. The spontaneous philosophy, we begin here, and this is actually formed too. There's a socialization process that makes us into spontaneous philosophers, of which we have a common sense that has become dominant in us, etc. But Gramsci thinks that this is, unconscious, fragmented, And he has a good discussion about mechanical. This is an attack on mechanical materialism, right? And obviously the temporality is empty, right? So this is going on in spontaneous philosophy constantly, right? And spontaneous philosophy, or the spontaneous philosopher, is also very ahistorical in the sense that history is not in the mix, right? So it's very important to remember, the unconscious, of course, knows no history, according to Freud, but anyway, he uses this unconscious, that we live a fragmented existence, we wear different hats, we're the chairman of a department, we're, 1 minute we're a father the rest of the day, or, we're a cook at another part of the day, we're an athlete, et cetera, et cetera. The fragmented sense, which is very much away from the dream of the whole person that Marx and Gramsci share, and of course taken up by the Cuban revolutionaries, the new man, building the new man, the mechanical, that we are imposed upon from the external environment, going back to reactive politics, that this is spontaneous philosophy, what you see on MSNBC, the other side of the common sense equation. You have the other two conflicting ideological networks, O'Donnell, Maddow, Ari Melber, I forgot all these people, Chris Hayes, all these people, Brian Williams versus Ingram, Hannity, I forgot all these other characters they have, but anyway. So you see this battle, the site, for the winning of the masses, the popular site. This is taking place in common sense. It's how people have been socialized to a certain kind of degree to try to win over people. So the mechanical is about those who are directly influenced by the external environment. I'm always reminded of David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd. You have two types of personality. I know it's reductive, like heart attack and cancer victims, type A and type B, but anyway, Reisman said they're the outer directed, who are completely directed by their peers or by the outside forces, versus the inner directed. Werner Herzog knows he wants to be a filmmaker at 12 years old, and he is a filmmaker by the time he's 16. But anyway, the two types of birth, but this is very reactive to the external environment versus that of a fuller life. And the experience of time is very empty. You always are being filled. And this is a generational problem now with digitalization. You have a real problem now in terms of temporality. How are people, under 40 or whatever, I don't know, I'm speculating there, but how do people now who live on phones, live through and by the screen all the time, experiencing temporality and time, and the lack of history. So this becomes a very, very interesting moment in terms of the spontaneous philosophy, and then how this feeds, in some ways, common sense. Whereas philosophy of praxis, the way you get to philosophy of praxis, according to Gramsci, is through philosophy is criticism and superseding of religion. That's his first definition of philosophy. It is critical and militant, and it's a supersession of religion in particular. Also, the praxis has in mind here a higher conception of life. It is not the conception of life as it is, or progress, as we were discussing earlier today. It is a higher conception of what life can be. It's speculative, right? It's moving towards something that is not there yet. But it's the not yet, in Ernst Bloch's phrase of temporality. A not yet, right? The philosophy of the not yet, temporally, right? Very futural based as well, right? And it's inner directed, not mechanical, it's organic, right? And one's lever is critical self-awareness. And I like the phrase he uses, this is in the section on practice. One takes an inventory of the traces, right, in a way, very Derridian in a certain way. You trace, but through a self-critical moment, the inventory of elements that have been deposited in you, etc., and work with that as much as you can. And that inventory is going to show you how your common sense has been formed, how you've been affected, maybe even dominated by the communist census and the common sense of your moment, right, in a lot of ways. So again, you could put a lot of reactive, you could really look at this in a way that these are reactive forces at work. Yeah, we're all part of this. This is the easy way. We're gonna react, we're gonna send Susan Collins $50. I'm not Susan Collins, we're gonna send the anti-Susan Collins campaign $50. Yeah. We're gonna go march, we're gonna go demonstrate and stay outside the White House and sleep there all night, right? We're gonna go on TV, we're gonna build coalitions only. I'm not knocking all that, I mean, that's not the point. The point is that we've been reduced only to these reactions of protest and so-called resistance, yes.
I was just reminded of something. I was reading
Yeah.
some of the work of the Invisible Committee.
Yeah. Now? You're reading
Yeah,
now?
I was reading now.
Yeah.
And they referred to these political demonstrations as being more like funeral dirges than anything else.
They are, that's right. Yeah. Now is the new work. I don't know if you know the Invisible Community out of Paris, well, out of actually the countryside, French countryside. They began with a book called The Coming Insurrection. And if you're interested, myself, John Clark, Jeremy Glick, and Richard Dientz from Rutgers all participated in a panel. And one of their people were there, some French guy, raised it. We don't have discussions like this in France. I said, well, welcome to only in America, right? So anyway, but we did a thing. But the Invisible Committee has gone on. They did a thing called, what was the second one?
To Our Friends.
To Our Friends. And now
Theory
it's
of the
now.
Young Girl.
Yeah.
And now.
The theory of the young girl is interesting because it has nothing to do with the young girl as young girl.
No.
Although right away, reactive forces, they're misogynists, they're, anti-woman, the whole bit. Nobody reads.
We're all the young girl.
Yeah, we're all
That's
the young girl.
common
No,
sense.
look at me. I mean,
The young
go out
girl
and buy a
is
new
the,
shirt. Yeah.
the young girl is the common sense.
Right.
Like
That's
Bo
right.
Burnham does this. All 13-year-old girls all love his comedy for some reason.
Who's this? I'm sorry.
It's the comedian who just came out with this movie. What was it? 13 Teenage Girls or something.
Oh yeah.
But he for some reason he sort of realized that all these young teenage girls are attracted to his comedy. They all think he's telling their story or something. It's very
Interesting.
bizarre.
Oh boy. Okay. All right.
But I-
So yeah. Anyway, to go back to this, so the movement here in terms of these preliminary sections of reference for Gramsci is to try to get us to this point of a struggle in common sense, which is ongoing and never ending. Common sense is not just bad and we overcome it. We try to overcome it, but again, we're trying to take the old common sense and replace it with a new common sense, and it's good sense in his vocabulary, which attacks this common sense and makes it into intellectual order, right? And this is
Yeah.
where philosophy comes in, as a moment, right? Why we study philosophy, to look at what the new conception could be, the creation of the new language, the new radical imagination, if you will, in some ways.
Now comes out of the Situationists, which gets you back to the 1968 revolution.
Yes.
You have that same attempt to replace the common sense by graffiti on the walls, trying to...
Which Invisible Community is still doing
Yeah.
too. Yeah.
Yes, that's what now is
Right.
doing, yes.
Right,
During Nuit debout,
yes, right.
they
Whether
cite a
it's
lot of
old or
those
not.
new graffitis, and they're very interesting when put side to side with the 68
Right.
graffitis.
They
They're
also
just as imaginative.
They talk about détournement, which is to take like culture jamming.
She's an expert on the Society of the Spectacle. Yeah, go ahead. I'm
You
sorry.
take détournement, the obvious example of détournement is the meme, where you take a familiar picture and then you put writing on it that gives it a totally different context, sometimes funny or sometimes subversive. And that's what
Yeah.
now is doing.
Right. So anyway, again, the idea here is to, struggle here, and going back to these two terms, this is when you begin to see the ideological, right? This is where ideology is most active in this process of getting to how did the common sense come to be what it is. And again, read common sense as everything from empiricism in philosophy, right? Our daily struggles in which things have become part of popular culture and popular expressions, because he'll go through a lot of things of, philosophical expressions such as "that's life," right, or "that's the way it goes," or this kind of stuff. He'll use these expressions in this text, as well as being a site of where ideas, even scientific ideas, have become the norm, right? How the norm has been, established and legitimated. What is this legitimization process, how it's come to be? So it's multi-layered. It's just not, you're going to get out of common sense. Part of the role of good sense is to look at common sense in order to create a new conception, right, outside of it. It's really to create a new conception of a society, right? Yeah, please, yeah.
So what is it fundamentally that enables someone to go from spontaneous philosophy to common sense to praxis? Is it sort of the concept of Geist, like this kind of fundamental determination? Is it the Nietzschean will, something like that? Is it a rewriting of a Nietzschean will?
For him, yes, and for him it's a critical awareness of where one is and where one is in history. Yeah, it's a critical awareness of this. This is the lever, and he speaks to this, early on in the points of reference. Yeah, so this is fundamental to him, that you need this, on all levels in order to make any kind of sense, if you will, right? Any kind of direction to common sense, both of how it's been formed in you, how it operates in the society, and then thirdly and most importantly, how you overcome it with a new common sense. So it's kind of this inventory of where one is. What's motivating this, yes, of course, is the optimism of the will. I mean, he's very much, he knows this very well.
But he seems to not like Nietzsche.
Political will. I'm sorry?
In the last pages, he sort of has a critical perspective on Nietzsche.
Yes, he does. Well, I mean, he's not going to appropriate, especially, I mean, I guess some of you know, Nietzsche in Italy is a real tour de force of fascism, right? We used to do Heidegger in New York on the East River, but anyway, Nietzsche in Italy, the major thinker is Julius Evola, right? So there's a Nietzscheanism that they're fighting very actively in the party. I mean, Nietzsche was not known as, and in a way, this continues. It hasn't been translated yet, but I've seen a little bit of the galleys by Domenico Lasordo. The translation, Nietzsche, the aristocratic rebel. Hopefully we'll get it soon, but this tradition of Italian Nietzscheism is coming kind of full circle with Lasordo, who is a Communist Party member up until its demise, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, where do you see this on Nietzsche? What pages are you on? Because we can move there too, because, common sense here, again, in the historical, we just don't want to read this as an internal critique of the left. We want to read it also in terms of, what's going on historically with Gramsci and how is it, quote unquote, relevant today, So, yeah, what page is the Nietzsche?
Sorry, I'm
yeah, it's all right. I just want to, I'm going to point out a couple of things. I know we're getting, I'll give a little more time and Peter can wait a few minutes. My comrade there, yeah. So, go ahead, tell me.
It's 369.
Okay.
Where Nietzschean charlatans, he goes on. But in fact, he's a Nietzsche himself, just of the Marxist version.
Well, this is Evola and others,
right.
Because Nietzsche did not revolt against all everything that exists, right? Nietzsche, in a way, had a radical conservatism, and in some ways, Gramsci, and what I'm speaking to today, in some ways, there's a radical conservative notion of common sense. He's not saying the violent overthrow of everything exists. He's not talking about completely wiping the slate clean. He's talking about a conservation of some stuff, but, killing the old concepts in order to make way for the new. But he's very respectful of this, in a way. So there's a radical conservatism going on here as well. I think this is important to keep in mind. So I think he's looking at those Nietzscheans, you know, maybe he would consider the future as part of this,
Right.
this moment, or certainly Evola and them, who were antagonists. Julius Evola is a major antagonist of the Italian left. And he's not stupid, you know, he's not stupid, but he, you know, yeah, it's a good book on the occult he wrote, Evola, you know, so, yeah. You know, as Curtis Jackson, otherwise known as 50 Cent, says, it's good to know your enemies better than they know themselves. Yeah, anyway. So yeah, let me go on. Yeah, this is history and anti-history. It's going on the history of the problem.
Yeah.
You know, I know we're not going to get through all of this today, but let me just point out a couple of really important parts here. Okay, so the main thing is to see this as a movement, right? And the consciousness is the critical awareness. You begin to see these oppositions, these dialectical tensions that are taking place between being unconscious and becoming critically aware, being fragmented, moving towards more of a totality or a wholeness, mechanical, you know, and organic, if you will, and certainly empty time into fuller time. You know, you're beginning to see these kind of tensions that rise up. Okay, so let me just look at this real quickly vis-a-vis religion and common sense. So if you turn to page 325, 326, 327 really. Religion and common sense, 326. Religion and common sense cannot constitute an intellectual order because they cannot be reduced to unity, one, and coherence even within an individual consciousness, yet alone a collective consciousness. Or rather that it cannot be reduced freely, so reduced freely, for this may be done by authoritarian means, which is interesting, you know, it's thinking this through, and indeed within limits this has been done in the past. Note the problem of religion taken not in the confessional sense, you know, but in the secular sense, and this would have worked well earlier today in Stanley's class, of a unity of faith between a conception of the world and a corresponding norm of conduct. A very good working definition of what religion does, right? The unity of faith, right? Conception of the world and the corresponding norm of conduct. But why, frankly, do we call this unity of faith religion, right? And not ideology? It's a very important passage. It's very interesting. Yeah? Why is the unity of faith not called an ideology instead of why are we calling it religion still? Or even, frankly, more radically put, politics, right? And that, of course, you know, will be the transition to Peter's course, you know, when you read Aristotle's Politics, Book 1 today, you know, what is the political, what does politics really mean here? And, you know, Gramsci certainly has some Aristotelian background. Okay, philosophy does not exist. He goes through that there are various philosophies. As Sartre, and we're going to read later, I'm going to give you a little section of Search for a Method, or the question of method, the introduction to the critique of dialectical reason, in which he says there are no philosophies, there are only ideologies up to date, you know, up to Marx, right? And so Sartre is going to say this, Gramsci, he's getting this from Gramsci. Sartre claims he didn't read Gramsci until the 1970s, which, you know, when he was blind, but anyway, this is another aspect going on. But he was very impressed. Yes, please, yeah.
This is what I was asking you.
Yeah,
earlier,
yeah, sure.
Why common sense isn't just the dominant ideology?
Well, it is part of this.
Epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, all that.
I mean, it becomes part of that, but you have to look back in. I mean, remember, the dominant, the hegemony is actually looking back into the common sense, right? It just doesn't become, you know, quote, dominant, right? The common sense is a richer concept in the sense that it has a very long background to it in terms of everybody, you know, being socialized into this, right? And how you were socialized into it. It's only through critical awareness, consciousness, if you will, I mean, for lack of a better term, that we begin to see this as ideological and then ultimately political. Yeah, I mean, does that, I mean, I don't know. Yeah,
Yeah, but I was just.
Yeah, please,
the
yeah.
fact that, I mean, later you mentioned that, you know, how to say it, and also person you just named.
Sartre.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's, if they're borrowing it from Gramsci, it's, for their conception is more like they just take it as ideology. It's, you know.
Yes, but the ideological, the family just doesn't come out of nowhere and become dominant. It creates a kind of value and a system of norms, and you have different kinds of families. The same thing with the church. The church may just become a metaphor for authoritarian, faith-based things, where coalitions that are authoritarian be part of a church apparatus today. And then, of course, the educational system is really the place of struggle, and some people are trying to now say the media is the fourth branch of the ideological state apparatus. To me, media is part of education, but, that's another story. Yeah, please, yeah.
Just to
Yeah.
clarify,
Yeah, sure.
I think what I learned was the difference
Yeah,
between
yeah.
common sense and ideology was its position in many institutional sites, like
Yes.
you mentioned, the family,
Right.
religion, schools, media, etc.
Right,
So it's deep and complex.
yes.
Yeah, but as you say, it caused this, the ISAs, the ideological state apparatuses, it's part of that. So,
Yes, I mean, the state appropriates this and then uses it in terms of hegemony, and we have counter-hegemonic struggles in a way, and it becomes an institutional practice in some ways. But for Gramsci, the beginning is really to look at this both in terms of its popular expression and all of that, which is not always, ideological, right? Not always ideological in some ways. You go talk to a black blues musician in Mississippi, they don't have ideology, they see it for what it is.
Right,
I mean,
but
in a
that's-
sense, right?
yeah.
Even though,
But
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
if you consider the the concept itself,
Yeah.
not in the sense that
Right.
it has come to be considered. Later.
Okay. Yeah. I hear where you're coming from in terms of the influence and what it actually became. I think, look, for us to really work with Gramsci well, we need to see these tensions and these movements between these fields. So I don't want to get to the fixity of one is common sense and then the other is ideology.
Right.
Well,
we get the idea.
yeah, exactly. But he wants to talk about why not call religion, which is a fragment of common sense, an ideology. Why would we just re-language this as a conception, right? Unity of faith. Why do we call this unity of faith religion? Why does this lead to the church as an ideological apparatus, right? Why don't we just call it ideology? And of course, Althusser will take that up. One of the chief ideologies becomes the church as an institution, right? Still enormous power, despite,
Along those lines, I thought, I was just struck too by how much time Gramsci seems to spend on Catholicism too.
Yes.
The specificity of Catholicism.
Yes.
Which is different from Protestantism.
That's correct.
It isn't just the church broadly or Christianity, but it's,
The Italian Catholic Church.
Culture and church.
The Medicis and forward.
Yeah.
Yes,
And he has
indeed.
a little brief thing about, Weber and Protestant ethic. That's
Very,
sort of a
very-
different set of
yes.
circumstances.
Yes, and he also talks about how the church, how the Jesuits are formed, that it's a response to the Dominicans and the Franciscans. Yeah, that, that the splinter groups, this kind of movement out of common sense of the dominant Roman Catholic Church at that time, produced such subgroups as the Dominicans and the Franciscans, right, at a particular moment in history, and why the hardened organism called the Society, the SJs, the Jesuitism, takes place. And this is a very interesting moment to me, because when you really think about Jesuitism, it still works in many of these schools we have, right? Many of these schools. This is an ideology that has, Rachel's laughing. Anyway,
I'm cured now.
Yeah, you're cured. You got over the nun story, huh? Yeah, you rewrote that movie, huh? Anyway, the thing for Gramsci is, yes, this moment in terms of Ignatius Loyola building this incredibly militaristic, organism that basically saved the church, that became extremely good educators. I mean, these people, pinprick Jesuits, Nafta in the Magic Mountain, the pinprick Jesuit, for detail. The devil is in the details. Where do we get these slogans from? These are all part of, church philosophy, religious, ideology going forward. Yeah, please.
Doesn't he
Yeah.
say that these movements, like the Jesuits arise when the institution becomes separated from the masses, and there needs to be a corrective. In this case, I think he uses the Jesuits
Well, yeah.
to help the institution realign with the masses.
He uses the example of the simple, right? And what happens with the simple people, if you read, the simple need to be conditioned and kept in the fold. And the simple are never really liberated, but they're taught, they're instructed. Hence didacticism, right? That comes out of the church's learning. So we can teach Galileo to them, but Galileo will be taught as a heretic to the church, but this is how the universe works according to Galileo. So meaning that you don't want to, be like Galileo and, be a heretic, but it's okay to understand the theory, but God's somewhere out there, right, in some ways. Yeah, I mean, the church is very masterful at taking up this stuff. Remember Galileo was on the index for 400 years.
They
Just renewed him. Spinoza, 350 years with the synagogue. So this stuff is powerful. In terms of quote unquote the pedagogical and the educational apparatus. So this is one of the reasons he's doing, and you're absolutely right. This is about how Jesuitism ultimately morphs into the Christian Democratic Party, which is his main antagonist. In all of this. It's the social democrats on one side and the Christian Democrats on the other. And
It says something about that Catholicism renders the human bad or
Yes.
evil, locates evil
Yes.
in human beings,
yes,
which renders them unable to become historical subjects in a sense. If
Well,
you
you
don't
only-
get that off your back,
Right.
you're never going to
you're going to fight for redemption,
self-actualize.
salvation, right? Yeah, original sin. We're evil. We did it. We're the original debt. This is very deeply ingrained in us. Very
You're forever
deeply.
dependent
Then you have a
on it.
John Calvin that comes along and says, okay, we're going to make this into interest-bearing loans. You think you owe God, wait till you see the banks, right? Right? Yeah. Original sin. Yeah, what a conception, huh? And then life after death. You got two swindles going on. You owe, and ultimately you're going to be given the big, payoff at the end. So you win the lottery to heaven. Mother Custer's goes to heaven. If anybody's seen that movie, The Fassbenders. Yeah, right. So anyway, okay. Well, maybe I should conclude now since Peter's here. So I'll send out a little summary. I'll deepen it, the stuff we didn't do today, and I'll let you know if it's going to be Arto only or both me and Arto next week. And if I don't see you, have a good week. And thank you. And we'll take it up. Josh is going to leave up the stuff if you want to download quickly for at least a couple of days until we check with our lawyers, with the official juridical order. Okay, thank you very much.